The recruitment hall buzzed with nervous energy as hundreds of young beings from across the galaxy waited for their names to be called. Representatives from 17 different species sat in organized clusters, their various forms creating a colorful tapestry of galactic diversity. The Zephyrians with their crystalline skin caught the light beautifully, while the massive Croakans dominated entire sections with their bulk. Delicate ethereals floated slightly above their seats, and the insectoid Vex clicked constantly in their native tongue. In the far corner, almost invisible among the crowd, sat a single human. Marcus Chen kept his eyes down, focused on the worn datapad in his hands. At 19, he was younger than most candidates and significantly smaller than almost everyone else in the room. His plain gray jumpsuit marked him as coming from one of the Outer Rim colonies, the kind of place where people struggled just to afford basic necessities. "Next group, please report to Evaluation Chamber 7, announced a melodic voice that somehow translated perfectly into every language present. Marcus looked up briefly, noting it wasn't his turn yet. Around him, conversations flowed in dozens of languages, most of which his universal translator could barely keep up with. A group of Altarian cadets near him were discussing their families' military histories with obvious pride. Their blue skin seemed to shimmer as they gestured excitedly about ancient battles and honored ancestors. Marcus couldn't help but overhear their conversation, even though he tried to focus on his datapad. "My great-grandfather served in the Helix campaign," one of them boasted. "He commanded 3 battle cruisers and earned the Star of Valor twice." "That's impressive," another replied. "But my family line goes back to the founding of the Galactic Defense Force. We've had officers in every major conflict for the past 4 centuries. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. His own family history was far less glamorous. His parents worked in mineral extraction on a frontier world called Haven's Edge. The closest they'd come to military service was operating mining equipment that happened to be built by defense contractors. He had no family connections, no legacy to lean on, and no impressive stories to tell. The evaluation process had been going on for 3 days now. Marcus had watched as cadets were called forward in groups, sorted by species and evaluated for their potential. The testing was supposed to be fair and unbiased, but he'd noticed patterns. The physically impressive candidates went first. Those with family connections got special attention. The wealthy ones had private tutors to help them prepare. A commotion near the front caught everyone's attention. A massive Croakan was arguing with one of the evaluation officers, his deep voice rumbling through the hall like distant thunder. Even with the translator, the meaning was clear. He was demanding to know why his test scores weren't being processed faster. The officer, a small but dignified Centaurian, was trying to explain the standardized procedures, but the Croakan's impatience was growing. "Do you know who my family is?" the Croakan bellowed. "We've been warriors for 10,000 years. This delay is insulting!" Other candidates watched the confrontation with interest. Some nodded in agreement, clearly feeling that their own heritage should grant them special consideration. Marcus found himself wondering if he'd made a mistake coming here. What did a mining colony kid have to offer compared to these beings with their proud warrior traditions and political connections? His datapad chimed softly. Marcus glanced down and saw a message from his parents, sent weeks ago but just now reaching him due to the communications delay. His mother's face appeared in a small hologram, smiling despite the exhaustion that showed around her eyes. "We're so proud of you, Marcus," her recorded voice said quietly through his earpiece. "Remember, being quiet doesn't mean being weak. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who don't need to shout about it." The message was simple, but it reminded him why he was here, not for glory or family honor, but because he'd scored in the top percentile on every aptitude test he'd ever taken, because he could solve problems that stumped others. Because when the evacuation sirens had sounded during the asteroid impact on Haven's Edge 2 years ago, he'd been the one to figure out the optimal evacuation routes that saved hundreds of lives. "Group 47, please report to Evaluation Chamber 12, the voice announced. Marcus checked his number. 47. This was it. He stood up, gathering his few belongings. Around him, other members of Group 47 were doing the same. Most were significantly more impressive than he was. A pair of Vex warriors clicked to each other in what sounded like tactical planning. An ethereal glided gracefully toward the indicated chamber, barely touching the ground. A Zephyrian's crystal skin pulsed with confident energy. As they walked together toward the evaluation chamber, Marcus noticed something interesting. While the others were busy talking about their qualifications and expectations, he was observing. The Vex moved with precision but seemed to have trouble adapting when other people got in their way. The ethereal was graceful but appeared uncomfortable with the solid surfaces and confined spaces of the station. The Zephyrian's confidence was impressive, but Marcus wondered if it might be masking inexperience. The evaluation chamber was larger than Marcus had expected, with multiple stations set up for different types of testing: physical assessments, mental challenges, psychological evaluations, and something labeled crisis simulation that looked particularly intimidating. Officers from various species staffed each station, their expressions professionally neutral. "Welcome." Candidates, announced the lead evaluator, a distinguished-looking human woman with silver hair and sharp eyes. "I am Commander Sarah Torres. Over the next several hours, you will be tested on every aspect that matters for service in the Galactic Defense Force. Physical capability, mental acuity, emotional stability, leadership potential, and most importantly, your ability to work with others." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the group. "I want to be clear about something. We're not looking for the strongest, the fastest, or the loudest. We're looking for the ones who can think clearly under pressure, who can adapt to any situation, and who put the mission above their own ego. Some of you will surprise yourselves today. Others may discover that military service isn't for them. Both outcomes are valuable." Marcus felt a small spark of hope. Maybe there was a place for someone like him after all. The first test was physical assessment, and Marcus knew this would be his weakest area. The other candidates moved through the obstacle course with varying degrees of success. The Krogan candidate, whose name was apparently Thork, smashed through barriers that were meant to be climbed over. The Vex moved with mechanical precision but struggled with anything requiring creativity. The ethereal simply floated over most obstacles, which the evaluators noted with interest. When Marcus's turn came, he approached the course differently. Instead of trying to match the raw power or unique abilities of the others, he studied each obstacle carefully before attempting it. Where others had charged forward, he found efficient paths. Where they had used brute force, he used leverage and timing. His overall time was middle of the pack, but the evaluators seemed to be writing extensive notes about his approach. "Interesting technique," commented the evaluation officer, a veteran Altarian with scars crossing his blue face. "Most humans try to compensate for their physical limitations with aggression. You chose efficiency instead." Marcus nodded but didn't elaborate. He'd learned long ago that actions spoke more clearly than explanations, especially when people were already making assumptions about what he could or couldn't do. The mental challenges came next, and this was where Marcus began to shine. The tests were designed to be species neutral, focusing on problem-solving, pattern recognition, and logical reasoning rather than specific knowledge. While other candidates struggled with multi-dimensional puzzles, Marcus found himself working through them almost intuitively. One test particularly caught his attention. It was a tactical scenario involving resource allocation during a siege. The scenario was complex, with multiple variables changing in real time and no clear optimal solution. Most candidates approached it systematically, trying to maximize obvious factors like defensive positioning or supply conservation. Marcus took a different approach. He spent the first several minutes not making any moves at all, simply observing how the simulation evolved. The other candidates were already deep into their strategies, but Marcus was looking for patterns they might have missed. When he finally began making decisions, they seemed almost random at first. He allocated resources in ways that appeared inefficient, sometimes even counterproductive. But as the simulation progressed, his strategy became clear. He wasn't optimizing for the obvious metrics. Instead, he was setting up conditions that would become advantageous much later in the scenario. When supply lines started failing for the other candidates, Marcus's seemingly wasteful early investments paid off. When their defensive positions became untenable, his flexible resource placement allowed for rapid adaptation. By the end of the simulation, while others were struggling to maintain basic operations, Marcus had not only survived the siege, but created conditions for a successful counterattack. The evaluating officer, a Centaurian strategist with centuries of experience, stared at the results for a long moment before making notes. "How did you know to prepare for the supply cascade failure?" she asked. "I didn't know for certain," Marcus replied quietly, but the initial parameters suggested that resource scarcity would become exponential rather than linear. Most people planned for gradual shortages, but the mathematical model indicated we'd hit critical points where small changes would have massive effects. The officer's eyes widened slightly. "You derived that from the opening scenario parameters?" Marcus nodded. The relationships between the variables suggested a system under stress. When systems like that start failing, they usually fail quickly. During the psychological evaluation, Marcus found himself sitting across from a human psychiatrist who seemed determined to understand what made him tick. Dr. Elizabeth Hawkins was middle-aged, with kind eyes but an intensity that suggested she missed very little. "Your fellow candidates have been quite vocal about their motivations," she began, reviewing her notes. "Family honor, personal glory, patriotic duty, adventure. But you've been remarkably quiet about why you're here." Marcus considered the question carefully. "I suppose I'm here because it seems like the right thing to do." "That's rather vague. Can you be more specific?" "The galaxy is a dangerous place," Marcus said slowly, choosing his words with care. "There are threats out there that require coordination between species, problems that can't be solved by any one world or any one type of thinking. The Defense Force represents our best chance to face those challenges together." Dr. Hawkins leaned forward. "And you believe you can contribute to that mission?" "I think everyone can contribute something," Marcus replied. "The question is whether my particular contribution is what's needed. What do you think your contribution would be?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering. "I notice things that others miss, not because I'm smarter, but because I approach problems differently. Sometimes that's useful." The final test of the day was the crisis simulation, and it would be conducted in teams. The evaluators divided the candidates into mixed groups, apparently trying to create diverse combinations of species and capabilities. Marcus found himself teamed with Thork the Croakan, an ethereal named Whisper, a Vex warrior called Click-7, and surprisingly, one of the arrogant Altarians from earlier named Zix. The scenario was a shipboard emergency. Their vessel had suffered critical damage. Life support was failing, and they needed to coordinate repairs while dealing with system cascades that were causing new problems faster than they could solve old ones. Each team member had access to different information and resources, making communication and coordination essential. Immediately, problems arose. Thork wanted to take charge, insisting that his family's military background made him the natural leader. Zix challenged this, claiming that Altarian tactical doctrine was superior. Click-7 began implementing solutions without consulting others. While Whisper seemed overwhelmed by the technical details of the simulation, Marcus watched the chaos for a few minutes, noting how the timer continued to count down while they argued. The life support indicators were already moving into yellow zones and the structural damage was spreading. If they didn't start working together soon, the simulation would end in total failure. "Excuse me," Marcus said quietly, but nobody heard him over the arguing. He tried again, slightly louder. "We need to coordinate our efforts." Still no response. Thork and Zix were now in a heated debate about command structures, while Click-7 had wandered off to work on engineering problems alone. Marcus made a decision. Instead of trying to shout over the others, he walked to the main console and began implementing a triage protocol. He couldn't fix everything, but he could buy them time by prioritizing the most critical systems. As alarms began to quiet and some of the red warning lights shifted to yellow, the others finally noticed what he was doing. "Hey," Zix protested. "Who authorized you to take control?" "Nobody," Marcus replied calmly, continuing to work. "But we have 14 minutes of life support left, and the hull breach in Section 7 is expanding at a rate that will cause catastrophic decompression in approximately 20 minutes. We can argue about who's in charge after we solve those problems." The simple clarity of the situation cut through their posturing. Thork moved to assist with structural repairs, his massive strength perfectly suited for the task. Zix's tactical knowledge proved invaluable for coordinating their limited resources. Click-7's technical precision was exactly what they needed for the delicate electronics work. Even Whisper found a role, using her species' natural empathy to monitor stress levels and prevent anyone from making panic-induced mistakes. Marcus didn't try to lead in any traditional sense. Instead, he facilitated, pointing out connections between problems, suggesting resource allocations, and making sure information flowed between team members. When Thork's repairs created opportunities for Zix's tactical solutions, Marcus made sure they both knew about it. When Click 7's technical work needed input from Whisper's psychological insights, Marcus helped translate between their very different perspectives. By the end of the simulation, they had not only survived the crisis but actually improved their ship's condition beyond the starting parameters. The evaluators were taking extensive notes, and Marcus caught several of them exchanging meaningful glances. As they filed out of the evaluation chamber, Thork clapped a massive hand on Marcus's shoulder. "That was well done, human. I misjudged you." Even Zix seemed grudgingly respectful. "Your approach was unconventional but effective." Marcus simply nodded, but inside he felt a growing confidence that maybe, just maybe, he belonged here after all. The results were posted 3 days later, and the recruitment hall filled with nervous energy as candidates crowded around the display screens. Marcus hung back watching as others pushed forward to find their names. Cheers of celebration mixed with groans of disappointment as the galaxy's future defenders learned their fate. Chen. "Marcus, accepted, report to Transport Base 7 at 800 tomorrow," he read when he finally made it to the screen. Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by the realization that this was just the beginning. Academy training would be far more challenging than recruitment evaluations. Around him, he noticed familiar faces from his evaluation group. Thork was bellowing his joy loud enough to shake the station walls. Zix looked satisfied but not surprised. Click 7's acceptance was indicated by a rapid clicking pattern that Marcus had learned meant contentment. Even Whisper had made it through, though she seemed almost surprised by her success. The transport to Galactic Defense Academy took 2 weeks, giving Marcus time to observe his fellow new cadets. The ship carried nearly 1,000 new recruits from across known space, representing every major species in the Galactic Alliance. The diversity was staggering, but so were the divisions. Natural groupings formed quickly along species lines. Humans clustered together, sharing stories about their homeworlds and comparing their reasons for joining. The Krokans dominated the recreational areas with their size and boisterous nature. Altarians formed study groups, approaching their preparation with methodical intensity. The Vex organized themselves into precise hierarchical structures that seemed to emerge automatically. Marcus found himself drifting between groups, rather than settling into any one of them. His quiet nature meant he was often overlooked, but it also meant he could observe dynamics that others missed. He noticed that while species tended to stick together, there were exceptions. Some individuals seemed as uncomfortable with their own kind as they were with others. A few appeared to be making deliberate efforts to cross species boundaries. One such person was a human woman named Captain Sarah Kim, though she wasn't actually a captain yet, just a cadet like the rest of them who happened to have prior military experience from her homeworld's defense forces. She was older than most recruits, probably in her late 20s, and carried herself with a confidence that suggested real leadership experience. Marcus first noticed her when she intervened in a dispute between a group of humans and some Altarian cadets. The humans felt that the Altarians were being condescending about Earth's military traditions, while the Altarians seemed genuinely confused about why the humans were taking offense. What could have escalated into a serious conflict was diffused by Sarah's ability to help both sides understand each other's perspectives. "You're the quiet one from Evaluation Group 47. She said to Marcus later that day, finding him in one of the ship's observation lounges. "I heard about your crisis simulation performance." Marcus looked up from the technical manual he'd been studying. "News travels fast." "Good news travels fast," Sarah corrected, settling into the chair across from him. "The evaluators were impressed. Word is that your team had one of the highest success rates in the entire recruitment cycle." "We worked well together once we figured out how to communicate," Marcus replied. Sarah smiled. "I watched the recordings. You didn't just help them communicate. You helped them discover what they were really good at. Thork mentioned that you made him feel useful for the first time since he'd arrived at the recruitment station." That surprised Marcus. The massive Croakan had seemed supremely confident throughout the evaluation process. He was having doubts. His family expected him to dominate every challenge through pure strength, Sarah explained. When he struggled with the mental tests, he started wondering if he belonged. Then your crisis simulation showed him that strength applied intelligently is far more valuable than strength applied randomly. Marcus considered this. He'd been so focused on solving the problems that he hadn't thought much about how his approach might affect his teammates' confidence. I just tried to match the right person to the right task. Exactly. That's a leadership quality that's harder to teach than tactical knowledge or strategic thinking. Sarah leaned forward slightly. Have you given any thought to what specialty you want to pursue at the academy? The academy offered multiple career tracks: command, engineering, tactical, intelligence, diplomatic corps, and several others. Most cadets arrived with clear preferences based on their species' strengths or their personal interests. Marcus had been struggling with the decision. I'm not sure yet, he admitted. I seem to be moderately good at several things rather than exceptional at any one thing. Sometimes that's exactly what the galaxy needs, Sarah said thoughtfully. Specialists are crucial, but so are people who can see connections between different specialties. Their conversation was interrupted by alarms sounding throughout the ship. Emergency lights began flashing, and the captain's voice came over the communication system speaking in rapid, urgent tones. The universal translators rendered his words clearly. All passengers report to designated emergency stations immediately. This is not a drill. The observation lounge filled quickly as cadets rushed in from throughout the ship. The confusion was immediate and overwhelming. Different species had different emergency protocols, and the ship's crew was too busy managing the actual crisis to provide detailed guidance. Some cadets were trying to organize evacuation procedures. Others were demanding information about what was happening, and a few seemed paralyzed by uncertainty. Through the observation windows, Marcus could see the problem. A massive debris field stretched ahead of them, the remnants of what looked like a destroyed space station. Their ship was decelerating rapidly, but pieces of wreckage were scattered across a vast area, and some chunks were large enough to cause serious damage if they struck the transport. "We need to help the crew," someone shouted. But the response was more chaos as different groups tried to implement contradictory plans. Marcus found himself moving toward the nearest communication panel, not because he'd decided to take charge, but because he needed more information before he could think clearly about the situation. Sarah followed him along with several other cadets who seemed to recognize that gathering facts was more useful than making assumptions. "Bridge, this is Cadet Chen in Observation Lounge 7, Marcus said into the communicator. "We have approximately 200 cadets here requesting instructions." "Cadet Chen, we're dealing with navigation hazards right now," came the stressed reply from a bridge officer. "Keep everyone calm and await further orders." "Understood, sir. Can you tell us the nature of the emergency so we can prepare appropriately?" There was a pause, then a different voice came on the line. Older, more authoritative. "This is Commander Torres. We've encountered the debris field from the destruction of Deep Space Station Omega-7. We're not in immediate danger, but we need to navigate carefully through the wreckage. The emergency stations are precautionary." Marcus felt relief, but he also noticed that many of his fellow cadets looked more confused than reassured. Commander Torres's explanation was clear to him, but he realized that not everyone had the same frame of reference for understanding space navigation hazards. "May I relay that information to the other cadets, sir?" Marcus asked. "Proceed, Cadet." Marcus turned to address the room, but instead of shouting over the nervous chatter, he walked to the center of the lounge and spoke in his normal voice to the few people nearest to him. "The ship encountered a debris field from a destroyed space station. We're not in danger, but navigation will be tricky for the next several hours. The emergency stations are just a precaution." The effect was almost magical. The people who heard him clearly passed the information on to others, and within minutes the room's anxiety level had dropped significantly. People began organizing themselves into small groups, some discussing what they'd learned about debris field navigation in their preparation studies, others sharing stories about similar situations they'd heard about. Sarah appeared at Marcus's shoulder. "You did it again." "Did what?" "Found the right solution for the situation. Most people would have tried to take control or give a big speech. You just made sure the right information got to the right people in the right way." Marcus watched as his fellow cadets continued to self-organize, their natural leadership abilities emerging, now that panic had been replaced by understanding. "Everyone here is smart and capable. They just needed to know what they were dealing with." "True," Sarah agreed. "But someone had to recognize that and act on it. That someone was you." As the ship slowly worked its way through the debris field over the following hours, Marcus found himself thinking about what Sarah had said about leadership. He'd always assumed that leaders were the people who stood in front giving orders and making speeches. But maybe there were other ways to help people accomplish things together. By the time they finally cleared the debris field and resumed normal operations, something had changed in the group dynamics among the cadets. The species barriers hadn't disappeared, but they seemed less. The Galactic Defense Academy was unlike anything Marcus had ever imagined. Built into a massive asteroid that had been hollowed out and converted into a training facility, it housed over 50,000 cadets at any given time. The scale was breathtaking, with training areas that could simulate everything from planetary invasions to deep space battles. Orientation began immediately upon arrival. The new cadets were divided into training companies of 200 each, with careful attention paid to species diversity. Marcus found himself in Delta Company, along with Sarah Kim, Thork, Zix, Click7, and Whisper from his transport. The remaining members of their company represented a cross-section of galactic civilization that was both inspiring and intimidating. Their company commander was a stern Centaurian named Major Krell, whose forearms and methodical approach to everything made him seem almost mechanical in his efficiency. His opening address to Delta Company was brief and to the point. "You are here because you have potential," he began, his translated voice carrying clearly through the assembly hall. Potential, however, is worthless without discipline, cooperation, and the willingness to put the mission above personal comfort. Over the next 2 years, we will discover whether that potential can be transformed into capability. The training schedule was brutal. Physical conditioning began at dawn, followed by tactical studies, technology familiarization, cultural sensitivity training, and practical exercises that seemed designed to push every cadet beyond their comfort zone. The academic workload alone would have been challenging for a university graduate program, but it was combined with physical demands that left most cadets exhausted by evening. Marcus struggled with the physical training as expected. While his human physiology wasn't the weakest among the various species represented, he was clearly at a disadvantage compared to the Croacan's strength or the Vex's endurance. What surprised him was how much he enjoyed the intellectual challenges, even when they were frustrating. Military history class, taught by an ancient ethereal named Professor Drift, covered conflicts spanning thousands of years and dozens of species. The complexity was staggering. Wars fought with weapons that could destroy planets, but also conflicts resolved through diplomatic innovation that prevented millions of deaths. Marcus found himself fascinated by the patterns that emerged across different species and time periods. Every military conflict is ultimately about resource allocation, Professor Drift explained during one lecture. The resources might be physical, territory, minerals, energy sources, or they might be conceptual, honor, religious beliefs, political systems. Understanding what resources are truly at stake is the first step toward finding solutions that don't require massive loss of life. The professor's gaze swept across the diverse classroom. Your generation will face threats that previous generations never had to consider. The galaxy is larger now, more connected but also more fragmented. The old models of conflict and resolution may not be sufficient. Marcus raised his hand, something he rarely did in class. "Professor, what kinds of new threats do you anticipate?" "Excellent question, Cadet Chen. We're seeing the emergence of entities that don't fit traditional models of civilization. Artificial intelligences that operate on timescales we can barely comprehend. Energy-based life forms that view matter-based existence as we might view primitive bacteria. Resource depletion scenarios that could affect entire galactic regions. The challenges your generation will face will require new forms of thinking." After class, Marcus found himself walking with Sarah toward their next training session. "Do you think he's right about needing new approaches?" she asked. "I think the galaxy is getting more complicated faster than our institutions are adapting," Marcus replied thoughtfully. The Defense Force was designed for conflicts between recognizable civilizations with understandable motivations. What do you do when you encounter something that operates by completely different rules? Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion ahead. A group of cadets had gathered around what appeared to be an argument between two of their classmates. As they got closer, Marcus could see that it was Thork and a Vex cadet named Strike Prime, and the disagreement seemed to be escalating rapidly. "Your approach is fundamentally flawed," Strike Prime was saying in the clipped, precise manner typical of Vex communication. Emotional decision-making leads to suboptimal outcomes. Logic dictates that resources should be allocated based on efficiency calculations. Logic doesn't account for everything. Thork rumbled back. Honor, loyalty, the willingness to sacrifice for others? These things matter more than your precious efficiency. The argument was drawing a crowd, and Marcus could see that other cadets were beginning to take sides along species lines. Humans and Krokans seemed to support Thork's position, while Vex and some Altarians sided with Strike Prime. The situation was beginning to look like it might escalate beyond a simple academic disagreement. Marcus glanced at Sarah, who nodded slightly. Without discussing it, they both moved closer to the two arguers, not to take sides but to understand what had triggered the conflict. "What's the specific scenario you're debating?" Marcus asked, his quiet voice somehow cutting through the heated exchange. Both Thork and Strike Prime turned to him, momentarily surprised by the interruption. Strike Prime answered first. "We were analyzing the Battle of Kepler Station. The human commander sacrificed 3 cruisers to save a transport convoy carrying civilians. Strike Prime believes this was an error because the cruisers represented more military value than the transports. And I believe," Thork added forcefully, "that protecting the innocent is what separates us from the enemies we fight. Military value isn't the only kind of value that matters." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "So you're debating whether the commander's decision was strategically sound?" "Exactly," Strike Prime confirmed. "The loss of 3 cruisers weakened our overall military position in that sector for months afterward. But saving those civilian transports meant that 15,000 refugees were able to reach safety," Thork countered. 15,000 lives that went on to contribute to the war effort in other ways. "Both perspectives have merit," Marcus said carefully. "Strike Prime is right that the immediate military cost was high. But Thork is also right that there were longer-term benefits beyond just saving lives." He paused, gathering his thoughts as both cadets and the growing crowd of observers waited for him to continue. "The Battle of Kepler Station happened early in the Helix War, right? When the galaxy was still deciding which side to support." "Yes," Strike Prime acknowledged. "Many species were still neutral at that point. So the commander's decision wasn't just about those specific ships and those specific civilians," Marcus continued. "It was also about what kind of organization the Defense Force wanted to be seen as. The news broadcasts about the sacrifice to save civilians were transmitted throughout neutral systems. They probably influenced more recruitment and alliance decisions than the tactical loss of 3 cruisers." Sarah picked up the thread. "In other words, the strategic value of the decision extended beyond the immediate military calculation. It was also about information warfare and alliance building." Thork's expression brightened. "Exactly. The commander understood that wars are won by more than just firepower." Strike Prime was quiet for a moment, processing this perspective. "I had not considered the broader informational impact. The decision becomes more defensible when those factors are included in the efficiency calculation." The tension in the crowd began to dissipate as other cadets started discussing the complexity of military decision-making. What had begun as a potential species-based conflict had transformed into an educational discussion about the multiple factors that commanders had to consider. Later that evening, as Delta Company gathered for their daily debrief session, Major Krell brought up the incident. "I understand there was a disagreement about historical tactical decisions earlier today." Several cadets shifted uncomfortably, expecting some kind of discipline for the public argument. Instead, Major Krell continued with what might have been approval in his voice. "The ability to analyze complex decisions from multiple perspectives is essential for officers. However, the ability to do so without fragmenting unit cohesion is equally important. From what I observed, this company managed to transform a potential conflict into a learning experience." His 4 eyes focused on Marcus for a moment. "Cadet Chen, your intervention was noted. You demonstrated the kind of thinking that turns problems into opportunities." Marcus felt uncomfortable with the attention, but nodded his acknowledgement. After the debrief session ended, he found himself approached by several classmates who wanted to continue the discussion about military decision-making. For the first time since arriving at the academy, he felt like he might actually belong here. As he prepared for sleep that night, Marcus reflected on the day's events. The academy was challenging in ways he hadn't expected. but it was also revealing capabilities in himself and his classmates that none of them had known they possessed. The galaxy was indeed becoming more complex, but perhaps they were learning to become more sophisticated in response. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But Marcus found himself looking forward to them rather than dreading them. Maybe Professor Drift was right about needing new approaches. Maybe this diverse group of cadets was exactly what the galaxy needed to face whatever came next. 6 months into their academy training, Delta Company faced their first major practical examination, a week-long war game that would pit them against 3 other companies in a complex scenario involving multiple objectives and limited resources. The exercise was designed to test everything they'd learned about tactics, logistics, cooperation, and decision-making under pressure. The scenario was grimly realistic. A frontier sector had been invaded by hostile forces, and 4 defense force companies had been dispatched to restore order. However, intelligence was limited, resources were scarce, and the companies would need to compete for strategic advantages while also coordinating against the common threat. It was the kind of situation that could easily fragment into chaos if the cadets couldn't balance competition with cooperation. Major Krell briefed Delta Company on their assigned objectives. You are responsible for securing the primary communication relay station and establishing a defensive perimeter around the civilian population center. However, you will also need to coordinate with the other companies to eliminate the hostile forces completely. Failure to achieve either objective will result in overall mission failure. The catch, as Marcus quickly realized, was that the objectives were interconnected in ways that weren't immediately obvious. The communication relay was essential for coordination between companies, but it was also the key to controlling the flow of intelligence about enemy movements. The company that controlled it would have significant advantages, but hoarding those advantages would make overall success impossible. Marcus had been appointed as Delta Company's intelligence officer, a role that surprised him given his lack of experience but made sense, considering his analytical abilities and his talent for seeing connections others missed. As they prepared for the exercise, he found himself studying not just the tactical situation, but the psychology of the other company's likely approaches. Alpha Company was led by a brilliant Altarian cadet named Commander Vex 9, who approached everything with mathematical precision. Beta Company was dominated by Croakan leadership that favored direct action and overwhelming force. Gamma Company had a diverse command structure but was known for creative solutions and unorthodox tactics. "What are you thinking?" Sarah asked, finding Marcus hunched over tactical displays in the company preparation room. "I'm thinking this exercise is as much about politics as it is about military operations," Marcus replied, highlighting different areas on the strategic map. "Look at the resource distribution. There's enough here for all 4 companies to achieve their primary objectives, but only if they coordinate effectively. If any company tries to maximize their own advantages, it creates cascading resource shortages for everyone else." Sarah studied the map. "So the real test is whether we can compete and cooperate simultaneously." "Exactly. And I think our best advantage is that we've already learned how to do that." Marcus pointed to their company roster. "Remember the transport incident? We have people here who know how to work across species lines even under stress." The war game began at dawn on a Monday, with all 4 companies deploying to different locations within the vast training facility that had been configured to simulate the frontier sector. The environment was impressive: realistic terrain, functioning infrastructure, and even civilian role players who would react to the cadets' decisions. Delta Company's first challenge came immediately. The communication relay station was located in difficult terrain that favored defensive positions but made rapid movement nearly impossible. Worse, initial reconnaissance revealed that one of the hostile force units was already entrenched near the relay, making a direct assault costly. "We could bypass them and establish our perimeter first," suggested Thork, who had been appointed as Delta Company's tactical officer. "Come back for the relay after we've secured our primary objective. But then we lose coordination capability during the critical early phase," Zix pointed out. As logistics officer, he was acutely aware of how resource allocation would be affected by delayed communications. Marcus was monitoring intelligence feeds from the other companies, trying to build a picture of the overall situation. What he saw worried him. Alpha Company was moving with typical Altarian efficiency toward their objectives, but they weren't sharing intelligence with anyone else. Beta Company was engaged in a massive frontal assault that was succeeding, but consuming enormous resources. Gamma Company seemed to be implementing some kind of complex strategy that none of the other companies understood. "We need to make a decision," Sarah said. As Delta Company's designated commander, she had ultimate responsibility for their choices, but she'd made it clear that she valued input from all her officers. "I have an idea," Marcus said slowly, "but it's risky, and it requires us to trust the other companies to make rational decisions." He outlined his plan quickly. Instead of trying to take the communication relay by force, Delta Company would establish communication with the entrenched hostile unit and attempt to negotiate. Not surrender, negotiation. The wargame rules allowed for diplomatic solutions, though most companies ignored that option in favor of direct military action. "The hostile forces are role-played by academy instructors," Marcus explained. "They'll have objectives and motivations beyond just fighting us. If we can figure out what they actually want, we might be able to resolve this without the resource costs of a battle." The idea was so unconventional that it took several minutes for the rest of the command team to fully grasp its implications. When they did, the response was mixed. "It could work," Whisper said thoughtfully. Her natural empathy made her skilled at understanding motivations. "But what if the other companies see negotiation as weakness?" "Then they'll make mistakes while we solve problems," Marcus replied. "Remember, the overall objective is to eliminate the hostile threat. It doesn't specify how." Sarah made the decision to try Marcus's approach, but with contingency plans in case negotiation failed. As Delta Company moved toward the communication relay, Marcus began broadcasting on open channels requesting dialogue with the hostile commander. The response came faster than expected. "This is Colonel Harrison, Hostile Force Unit 7. You're requesting negotiation?" "This is Intelligence Officer Chen, Delta Company. We're requesting discussion of terms for resolution of the current conflict." There was a long pause, then, "Interesting. Most cadet units prefer the direct approach. What makes you think we're interested in talking?" "Because prolonged conflict in this region serves no one's strategic interests," Marcus replied, hoping he was reading the scenario correctly. "We assume your forces have objectives beyond simply inflicting casualties on Defense Force units." Another pause, then what sounded like amusement in the colonel's voice. "Very well, Officer Chen. We'll meet under standard neutrality protocols, but come prepared to offer something more substantial than promises." The negotiation that followed was unlike anything Marcus had experienced in his training. Colonel Harrison, an experienced academy instructor playing the role of the hostile commander, represented a separatist faction that wanted independence for their region, but was willing to coexist peacefully with the Galactic government under specific conditions. The catch was that those conditions required coordination between all four Defense Force companies. The separatists wanted guarantees about trade routes, security arrangements, and cultural autonomy that could only be provided if the companies worked together, rather than competing against each other. Marcus found himself in the peculiar position of not just negotiating with the hostile forces, but also serving as a go-between for the four companies. Alpha Company's mathematical approach to resource allocation was essential for working out the economic details. Beta Company's commitment to honor and protection was crucial for the security guarantees. Gamma Company's creative thinking provided solutions for the cultural autonomy issues. The process took 3 days of intensive discussion, with military operations continuing in the background as a pressure mechanism. But gradually a framework emerged that satisfied everyone's core objectives. The separatists achieved their independence with security guarantees. The companies accomplished their missions without the massive resource costs of prolonged warfare. The civilian population was protected throughout the process. On the final day of the exercise, as all four companies assembled for debriefing, Marcus realized that something unprecedented had happened. They had not just succeeded in their individual objectives. They had created a model for the kind of complex problem-solving that Professor Drift had said their generation would need to master. Major Krell's evaluation was characteristically brief but telling. This exercise was designed to test your ability to balance competition and cooperation. Most years, companies focus so heavily on outperforming each other that they achieve suboptimal results for everyone. This year, Delta Company's innovative approach created a framework that allowed all companies to exceed their projected performance metrics. He paused, his four eyes scanning the assembled cadets. The galaxy is becoming more complex, and traditional approaches to conflict resolution are proving insufficient. What you've demonstrated here suggests that your generation may be capable of the kind of adaptive thinking that tomorrow's challenges will require. After the debriefing, Marcus found himself surrounded by cadets from all four companies who wanted to understand how the negotiation strategy had worked. For someone who had spent most of his life preferring to remain unnoticed, the attention was overwhelming. "You realize this changes everything," Sarah said to him later as they walked back to their quarters. "Word about this exercise is going to spread throughout the academy. You've demonstrated that there are alternatives to the traditional military approach." Marcus nodded, but he was thinking about something else. "I think we all demonstrated that. I just happened to suggest the approach. But it worked because everyone was willing to try something different." "Maybe," Sarah agreed, "but someone had to be willing to suggest it in the first place. Someone had to see the possibility when no one else did." As Marcus prepared for sleep that night, he reflected on how much had changed since his first day at the academy. He was no longer the quiet kid from a mining colony who wasn't sure he belonged. He was becoming something new, not just a military officer, but someone who could help others find new ways to solve old problems. The galaxy was indeed becoming more complex, but maybe that wasn't entirely a bad thing. Maybe complexity created opportunities for those who were willing to think differently about what solutions were possible. That the success of the war game exercise had unexpected consequences for Marcus and Delta Company. Word of their unconventional approach spread throughout the academy, bringing both recognition and scrutiny. Some instructors praised their innovative thinking, while others questioned whether diplomatic solutions were appropriate for military training scenarios. The debate came to a head during a special assembly 3 weeks after the exercise. Admiral Voss, the Academy's commanding officer, had called together representatives from all companies to discuss the implications of what Delta Company had accomplished. Admiral Voss was a legendary figure, a Centaurian who had served with distinction in 3 major conflicts and was known for his strategic brilliance. His presence at a cadet assembly was unusual enough to generate considerable excitement and nervousness among the assembled students. "The galaxy is changing," Admiral Voss began, his forearms gesturing with practiced authority. "The conflicts we face today are fundamentally different from those of previous generations. Traditional military doctrine, while still essential, may not be sufficient for the challenges ahead." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the diverse assembly of cadets. "Delta Company's recent exercise performance has raised important questions about how we prepare our officers for these new realities. Some of you will argue that military academies should focus on military solutions. Others will suggest that expanding our approach to include diplomatic and political strategies is essential for future success." Marcus felt hundreds of eyes turning toward him, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He hadn't asked to become the center of an academy-wide debate about military philosophy. "Cadet Chen," Admiral Voss continued, "you've been identified as the architect of the negotiation strategy that led to your company's success. Can you explain your reasoning for choosing that approach?" Marcus stood, his mind racing. This wasn't just a question about tactical decisions. It was about the fundamental purpose of military forces in a complex galaxy. "Sir, I believe that our primary mission is to protect galactic civilization and maintain peace. Sometimes that requires military action, but sometimes it requires other approaches. The war game presented us with a scenario where both objectives could be achieved more effectively through negotiation than through combat." "But what about military readiness?" called out a cadet from Alpha Company. "If we train cadets to negotiate instead of fight, are we preparing them for the realities of actual warfare?" Before Marcus could respond, Thork stood up from his position among the Delta Company cadets. "With respect, that's a false choice. Learning to negotiate doesn't make us weaker fighters, it makes us smarter fighters. In the exercise, we still had to be prepared for combat. The negotiation only worked because the hostile forces knew we could defeat them militarily if necessary." An Altarian cadet from Beta Company joined the discussion. "But military organizations need clear hierarchies and decisive action. How do you maintain command authority when everyone is expected to think diplomatically?" Sarah stood to answer this question. "Command authority comes from competence and trust. not from limiting how officers think about problems. In our company, Cadet Chen's strategic insights enhanced my ability to command effectively. They didn't undermine it. The discussion continued for over an hour, with cadets from all companies contributing perspectives on military doctrine, leadership philosophy, and the future of galactic defense. Marcus found himself both impressed and intimidated by the sophistication of the debate. These weren't just students discussing abstract theories. They were future officers grappling with questions that would shape how the galaxy addressed conflicts in the coming decades. Admiral Voss let the discussion run its course before intervening. This debate reflects a healthy diversity of thought that bodes well for the future of the Defense Force. However, I want to address a fundamental misconception that seems to underlie some of your concerns. He stood, his imposing presence commanding immediate attention. Military force and diplomatic negotiation are not opposing philosophies. They are complementary tools that must be used together to achieve lasting peace. The greatest military leaders in galactic history understood this. They won wars not just by defeating enemies, but by creating conditions where those enemies chose to become allies. The Admiral's gaze found Marcus in the crowd. Cadet Chen, your approach during the exercise demonstrated sophisticated understanding of this principle. You used the threat of military action to create conditions for successful negotiation, and you used successful negotiation to achieve military objectives more efficiently than combat would have allowed. Marcus felt a mixture of pride and responsibility at the Admiral's words. Thank you, sir. But I should point out that the approach only worked because my entire company was willing to try something unconventional. It was a team effort. Leadership often involves getting teams to attempt what seems impossible, Admiral Voss replied. The fact that you recognized the opportunity and convinced others to pursue it suggests aptitude for the kind of strategic thinking we need in our future officers. After the assembly, Marcus found himself approached by instructors he'd never met before. Professor Kellen from the Strategic Studies Department wanted to discuss how negotiation principles could be integrated into tactical training. Commander Torres from the Diplomatic Corps was interested in his thoughts on cross-species communication protocols. Even the Academy's chief psychologist wanted to understand how he'd analyze the motivations of the role-playing hostile forces. The attention was flattering, but also overwhelming. Marcus had always preferred working behind the scenes, analyzing problems and suggesting solutions without being the center of attention. Now he found himself viewed as some kind of innovative thinker, expected to have insights about questions that experienced officers had been debating for decades. You look like someone carrying the weight of the galaxy, observed a familiar voice. Marcus turned to see Click 7 approaching, the Vex cadet's mechanical precision somehow conveying what passed for amusement among his species. I feel like everyone expects me to revolutionize military strategy, Marcus replied with a tired smile. A few weeks ago I was just trying to pass my classes. Achievement creates expectations, Click 7 acknowledged. Among my people, this is considered both an honor and a burden. The key is remembering that expectations are merely data points, not obligations. Marcus appreciated the perspective. Click 7's species approached emotional challenges with the same logical framework they applied to technical problems, which could be surprisingly helpful at times like this. Have you given thought to your specialty selection? Click 7 asked. All cadets would need to choose their career track within the next few months, and the decision would shape the rest of their training. I'm still not sure, Marcus admitted. Command track makes sense given recent events, but I'm not convinced I want to be in charge of things. Intelligence appeals to me, but so does strategic planning. And after the exercise, several instructors have suggested diplomatic corps. Perhaps you are approaching the question incorrectly, Click 7 suggested. Instead of asking which specialty you want, ask which specialty would allow you to solve the kinds of problems you find most interesting. It was good advice, and Marcus found himself thinking about it as he walked back to his quarters that evening. What kinds of problems did he find most interesting? The complex ones, certainly. The ones that required understanding multiple perspectives and finding connections that weren't immediately obvious. The ones where traditional approaches had failed and new thinking was needed. 2 years after arriving at the academy as an uncertain young man from a mining colony, Marcus stood with his graduating class as Admiral Voss prepared to address them for the final time as cadets. The assembly hall held nearly 12,000 graduates representing every species in the Galactic Alliance. each preparing to begin their service as commissioned officers in the Defense Force. Marcus had chosen strategic operations as his specialty, a relatively new field that combined traditional military planning with diplomatic analysis and cross-species coordination. It was exactly the kind of role that matched his interests and abilities, allowing him to work on complex problems that required innovative solutions. The past 2 years had been transformative for him in ways he couldn't have anticipated. The quiet cadet who had once preferred to remain unnoticed had become someone others looked to for creative approaches to difficult challenges, not because he sought leadership, but because circumstances kept presenting him with problems that needed solving. During their second year, Marcus had helped resolve a crisis when a training exercise went wrong and left 50 cadets stranded in a damaged simulation environment. While rescue teams worked to extract them physically, Marcus had figured out how to maintain their life support systems by reprogramming the simulation to redirect power from non-essential systems. His solution had bought the rescue teams the time they needed to save everyone. In another incident, he had mediated a cultural conflict between human and ethereal cadets who couldn't understand each other's approaches to tactical planning. The disagreement had been escalating toward a formal complaint that could have damaged both groups' graduation prospects. Marcus had spent weeks working with both sides, helping them recognize that their different perspectives were actually complementary rather than contradictory. The eventual collaboration between the two groups had produced some of the most innovative tactical solutions the Academy had seen. Today, you cease to be cadets and become officers, Admiral Voss began, his voice carrying easily through the vast hall. The galaxy you will serve is more complex and challenging than any your predecessors have faced. The threats are more diverse, the alliances more fragile, and the consequences of failure more severe. Marcus listened, but his attention was also on his classmates around him. Sarah had chosen command track and would be commissioned as a lieutenant aboard one of the newest cruisers in the fleet. Thork was entering Marine Command, where his combination of strength and strategic thinking would serve him well. Click 7 had selected Engineering Corps, while Whisper had surprised everyone by choosing Intelligence, where her empathic abilities would help her understand the motivations of potential threats. However, Admiral Voss continued, you are also the most diverse, most educated, and most adaptable class of officers we have ever graduated. The challenges ahead will require exactly the kinds of innovative thinking and cross-species cooperation that you have demonstrated during your time here. The graduation ceremony proceeded with traditional formality, but Marcus found his thoughts drifting to what came next. His first assignment was to the Strategic Operations Center at Defense Force Headquarters, where he would work on threat assessment and response planning for the entire Galactic sector. It was an enormous responsibility for a newly commissioned officer, but Admiral Voss had personally recommended him for the position. The galaxy needs officers who can see connections others miss, the Admiral had explained during their final advisory meeting. Your record demonstrates exactly that kind of strategic thinking. The position will be challenging, but I believe you're ready for it. As the ceremony concluded and the new officers began receiving their assignments and commissions, Marcus felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. He had come so far from the uncertain young man who had arrived at the Academy 2 years ago, but he was about to face challenges that would make Academy training seem simple by comparison. So this is it, Sarah said, finding him as the crowds began to disperse. The end of our Academy days and the beginning of real service. It's strange, Marcus replied. I feel like I'm finally ready to do the work I came here to learn, but I also realize how much I still don't know. I think that's exactly how we're supposed to feel, Sarah suggested. If we felt completely prepared, it would probably mean the Academy hadn't challenged us enough. They were joined by the rest of their Academy friends, the group that had formed during those early uncertain days and had remained close throughout their training. Thork, Click 7, Whisper, even Zix, who had initially seemed so focused on individual achievement, but had learned to value collaboration. We're being scattered across the galaxy, Whisper observed. Different ships, different sectors, different types of missions, but I hope we stay in contact. We will, Thork said with characteristic certainty. Bonds forged in training last for life, and something tells me we'll find opportunities to work together again. Marcus hoped Thork was right. The group had accomplished things together that none of them could have achieved individually. The galaxy they were entering would need that kind of cooperation more than ever. 3 months later, Marcus sat in the Strategic Operations Center, surrounded by displays showing tactical information from across the galaxy. His role was to analyze emerging threats and recommend response strategies to senior commanders. The work was fascinating and important, but also overwhelming in its scope and complexity. The current crisis involved a breakdown in negotiations between the Galactic Alliance and a confederation of independent systems that had been gradually restricting trade routes. Traditional diplomatic approaches had failed, and military commanders were beginning to discuss the possibility of using force to reopen the routes. The situation was exactly the kind of complex challenge that required new thinking. Marcus had spent weeks analyzing the situation from every angle he could think of. The independent systems weren't acting out of simple hostility. They had legitimate concerns about economic exploitation and cultural autonomy that weren't being addressed by standard trade agreements. The Alliance's position was also understandable, as the restricted routes were affecting millions of people across dozens of systems. "What's your assessment, Lieutenant Chen?" asked Commander Park, the Strategic Operations Center's deputy director. She had become something of a mentor to Marcus, helping him navigate the complexities of working with senior officers who had decades more experience. "I think we're looking at this as a binary choice between diplomatic failure and military action," Marcus replied carefully. "But there might be a third option that addresses the underlying concerns rather than just the immediate symptoms." "I'm listening." Marcus activated a holographic display showing the disputed trade routes and the political boundaries of the systems involved. The independent systems are restricting trade because they feel economically exploited. They receive minimal benefits from the goods that pass through their territory. What if we restructured the trade agreements to give them a real stake in the economic activity? Commander Park studied the display thoughtfully. That would require convincing the major trading corporations to accept reduced profits in exchange for stable access. True, Marcus acknowledged, but it would also create long-term stability that would be more valuable than short-term profits, and it would establish a model for dealing with similar conflicts that are developing in other sectors. "Write up a detailed proposal," Commander Park said after a moment. "I'll present it at tomorrow's senior staff meeting. No guarantees, but innovative thinking is exactly what we need right now." As Marcus worked late into the night preparing his proposal, he reflected on how much his life had changed since those early days at the academy. He was no longer the uncertain cadet who wasn't sure he belonged. He had become someone who could contribute meaningfully to the most important challenges facing galactic civilization. The proposal he was writing might not be accepted, but the fact that senior commanders were willing to consider unconventional approaches suggested that the galaxy was indeed ready for new kinds of thinking. The diversity and innovation that his academy class had demonstrated were exactly what would be needed to navigate the complex challenges ahead. Marcus's battle record would never show dramatic victories or heroic charges, but it would show something equally valuable: a pattern of finding peaceful solutions to dangerous problems, of building bridges between opposing sides, and of creating stability in an increasingly complex galaxy. His record would speak louder than words because it would demonstrate that sometimes the most important battles were won not through force, but through understanding. That sometimes the greatest victories came not from defeating enemies, but from turning them into allies. As he finished his proposal and submitted it for review, Marcus realized that this was exactly the kind of work he had been meant to do. Not the dramatic, visible leadership that others might choose, but the quiet, essential work of making the galaxy a little bit better. One problem at a time, the silent cadet had found his voice, and it was speaking exactly the words the galaxy needed to hear.